actual point was that Richard's idea of how God would work, how God ought to work, is not, I think, the criteria for understanding what Christianity is predicting. For example, the gospel predicts, Jesus predicts, that the church of the kingdom of God will grow like a seed into a tree, and the birds of the air will flock to that tree, which implies slow growth over many years from a single point. And I think that's what the gospel actually predicts, as opposed to Richard Carrier's presumption about what God ought to be predicting. That was the distinction I was trying to make. I'm not at all suicidal. I'm not planning to shoot myself. Just to clarify that.
Just to clarify my view, what I'm saying is that God should act like a decent person. That's it.
Thank you. We could, this gentleman, please.
Yes. Can y'all speak to the Old Testament and how it points toward the accuracy of the New Testament? Because Dr. Carrier, you're talking about the New Testament, and you don't really have good evidence historically of its accuracy. You can't trace its roots, I assume is what you're saying. But the Dead Sea Scrolls seem to give us good indication that at least Isaiah, which has numerous prophecies pointing toward Christ that are corroborated in the New Testament, that through carbon dating was verified was hundreds of years before Christ. Explain some mathematics there to the audience, because we both, people who believe in God and people who don't, pretty much believe that mathematics is pure.
Yeah.
And there's some evidence there in the Old Testament that
right. I don't know what specific example you have in mind, but I'll give one because I have an idea. You mentioned Isaiah in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and there's an example in that. For the longest time, if we know from ancient Christian literature, the Christians were claiming that Isaiah had a passage about the suffering servant who dies to atone for the sins of Israel that mentions him being pierced. It mentions the guy being the servant who dies being pierced, and then a lot of modern scholars thought that no, that was a Christian fabrication. The Dead Sea Scrolls actually have that word in there, so we've actually confirmed that was an attested reading in Jewish literature before Christianity arose. Now, in basic terms of how prophecy works, I call that causation. I think that there were already Jews talking about a crucified, or someone who would be crucified in the future, that this would be the Messiah, and that this actually generated Christian belief later on. And in fact, my next book, which will come out towards the end of this year, on the historicity of Jesus Christ, will make an extensive, well-documented case for this. And I'm not the only one who's done it. There have been many scholars who've argued this, that there already were pre-Christian Jewish ideas of an expectation of a dying Messiah. And the Isaiah passage would even, from the Dead Sea Scrolls, would even suggest that they were anticipating that he would be crucified, and that this would therefore generate Christian belief. And it's not like Christian. I mean, if you have an example of you say something is going to happen, someone reads that and then goes and makes it happen, that's not fulfilled prophecy. That's humans actually making it happen.
Yeah, I don't really think that Jesus made the crucifixion happen, and I think there's a lot of details in the crucifixion and in the resurrection story that could not possibly have been arranged by Jesus or by the apostles either. And I think that there are some wonderful passages in the Old Testament that do point directly to Jesus. And the attempt to slow them off and say, well, they were just invented later, I think is very unlikely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
All right. This is for Dr. Marshall. In the case of the Salem witch trials, we have a multitude of accounts, first-hand accounts, and sometimes original source material of eyewitnesses to witchcraft, and oftentimes people confessing to witchcraft. So if the Gospels are the primary reason that we accept Jesus and what he did, and what we have basically are just supposed eyewitness accounts, do you accept that there were also witchcraft going on in the Salem witch trials? And if not, by what standard do you accept one and not the other?
Yeah, I think I explained that already. Those aren't miracles in the Christian sense. Secondly, if you look at them historically, and I have looked a little bit into the Salem witch trials, I don't really think you have the same sort of situation. Read the accounts of the Salem witch trials and read the Gospels. No, I don't see that the parallel is all that close. And the kind of event that is called witchcraft, people flying through the air and changing into beasts, is really not the same kind of event that is the central normative kind of miracles going on in the New Testament. You might find a few that look a little odd, but the central normative stories of the Gospels show Jesus doing a very different kind of act than anything you find in the Salem witch trials.
I'll just say that one of the books I'm selling today and that you can get online and in Kindle is The End of Christianity, and it has a chapter on it in it by a philosopher who actually makes a specific comparison between the Salem trials and the Gospels, and extensively talks about the documentation we have for the Salem witch trials, which is far better than we have for the miracles of Jesus. So if you want to really see how that plays out with an actual comparison of the texts and so forth, that's a chapter to read because it covers what you're talking about.
Thank you. Please.
This is the same question, but I guess addressed to both. Dr. Marshall, you said that in someone of Tiana, that some
Apollonius of Tiana.
Yes, that those two that account is incredibly different from that of the Gospel, and Dr. Carrier said it was incredibly similar. Could both of you explain why you took your respective sides?
Yeah, I don't say it's incredibly similar. I specifically noted there are many differences, but the point is that the differences aren't relevant to the debate. What we're looking for are particular criteria that supposedly make the miracles of Jesus more believable than the miracles of Apollonius, or that make the teachings of Jesus more divinely supernatural than the teachings of Apollonius. When you look at those criteria and then compare the two, one doesn't actually come out better than the other, and that's what I was saying. And you can do that by just go and read it. You can read Philostratus's Life of Apollonius of Tyana.
Yeah, one of my favorite stories in Apollonius of Tyana is about the monkeys in India that harvest peppers. They farm peppers, and the 25-meter crested dragons, different species that live in India. I would also urge you to read Apollonius of Tyana and get a good, but specifically, in my analysis of 50 characteristics of the Gospels, I found that Apollonius of Tyana, as I recall, something like 10 or 11 of those characteristics. Now, many of them actually are historicity-bearing characteristics that I talked about a little bit earlier on tonight. So, yes, absolutely, there's a wealth of historicity, of confirming evidence within the Gospels that you will never find anywhere in Apollonius of Tyana, especially for those kinds of events. Apollonius was a real person, though. I mean, he existed, but stories of him very late and very mixed up.
Thank you. Please.
My question is for Dr. Mitchell. Is there anything you would accept as disproof for the divinity of Jesus?
Was this a question for Dr. Marshall?
I'm sorry, I called you the wrong name, Dr. Marshall. I'm sorry. Is there anything you would accept for as disproof of the divinity of Jesus?
Anything you would accept?
Well, if you found Jesus' bones, that would certainly go a long ways.
Ironically, I don't agree. I think even if we did find Jesus' bones, Christianity could still be true. And in fact, I talk about this in a debate I had with William Lane Craig on PAX television years ago. You might be able to find it online somewhere, where me and Dr. Craig are on TV on Lee Strobel's television show. And I make out the case where I explain it, because I've defended the theory that, and there's extensive evidence for this, that the original Christians didn't think Jesus rose in the body of flesh, that he cast it aside like a shell and then rose from the dead in a new body, a new, more glorious, more powerful body. So that would leave the bones behind, and his resurrection would really have happened. So it's actually theoretically possible for the bones to exist and still for Christianity to be true. However, on the other side of that, we don't have the bones of hardly anyone from the ancient world, so the fact that we can't find his doesn't make Christianity reasonable either. So it's a wash as far as evidence goes.
Thank you. Please.
Dr. Carrier, getting back to the narrow thesis of the debate, do you have a cleaning lady that cleans your office by any chance? I had a cleaning lady in my office, and she had a lot of troubles in her life. And she got a lot of hope from reading her Bible And she couldn't have persisted very well without that, I don't think. You know, we give placebos to people. We know they don't scientifically, you know, exactly work. They work because they have this power in them, a belief. And so maybe, narrowly speaking, Christianity is sort of reasonable to believe by some people. Maybe for some of us it's not reasonable, but there's a reason perhaps for it. Would you agree with something like that?
No, for two reasons. The first is that it's simply not true that Christianity is the only way to give someone that placebo. There are tons of religions and secular philosophies that can also give someone hope or give them strength and power in adversity. So it's simply not the case that Christianity is the only one that can do that, and therefore that doesn't make Christianity any more reasonable than any other faith or any other non-faith.
Was the word only in the thesis of the debate?
Well, that's getting to my second point. The only way you can placebo someone that way is if you have them adopt a faith-based epistemology, an epistemology that makes it possible for them to believe false things just because they're useful. Now, if someone has that epistemology, they're going to believe a lot more false things because they think they're useful than just the one that you think will help them, including a lot of bad beliefs. And that's where we have a lot of trouble today because of that. For example, opposition to gay marriage, abuse of the rights of gays, for example, is a result of bad beliefs that get snuck in along the coattails of another placebo, which might be Christianity that gives hope, and so on. So if you're going to have that kind of epistemology, it's bad because you're going to be susceptible to false beliefs, essentially these infections of false beliefs. The only way to secure yourself and protect yourself from false beliefs that can lead you to do and say bad things is to have a non-faith-based epistemology, an epistemology that makes it very, very difficult for you to believe in false things. Now, the result of this is that you can't believe in false things that are useful, so you'd better find true beliefs that are useful instead. And it's much better if you do that.
Hear, hear for true beliefs. The term faith-based reasoning is a little bit misleading, though, I think, because Christians have based their faith on reasoning for 2,000 years, as we show in the book True Reason, and we'll be adding an appendix in the print version pretty soon. We'll show that in more explicit detail. One thing I would piggyback on this question, which I think is relevant, is one way in which it's relevant is God promised Abraham that through his seed he would bless all the nations of the earth. And Christians interpret that as referring to Jesus Christ. Now, I would argue and have argued that, in fact, the gospel has blessed the world more than anything else over the last 2,000 years. That's a topic for another debate or for another evening, but I think that is relevant to that question, and it is one way in which the impact of a belief is intellectually relevant to the reasonableness of that belief. Only one way.
It's funny, I actually expected him to use that argument in the debate, so I had to leave a whole page of my response out. Let's just do the short list.
Just very briefly, please.
The pagans gave us democracy, citizenship, human rights, in fact, the entire concept of rights, including freedom of speech, science, medicine, philosophy, formal logic, and mathematics. They also gave us a philosophical defense of moral virtues, including philanthropy, generosity, mercy, and honesty. Does that make paganism reasonable? No. The reason pagans came up with these things is not because they were pagans, it's because they just happened to be pagans at the time that these humans came up with these brilliant and beautiful and good ideas and disseminated them. The fact that Christians may have done and come up with good things and good ideas and done good things is not because they're Christians, it's because they just happened to be Christians at the time. If they were Muslims or if they were pagans at the time, they might have come up with the same ideas and done the same things, just as pagans did lots of great things that we also benefit from tremendously. So,
Do you want a short reply?
That will be another debate, definitely.
Thank you. Please.
Yes, thank you. After that, I don't want to waste my question, but the moral law comes from God. So, but I would like to, this for Dr. Marshall. I teach 2 classes on C.S. Lewis here in Huntsville at a local high school. And I was with the problem of pain and C.S. Lewis. I think there's 3 F's that you could maybe address and help the audience with, maybe the fall, free will, and faith. That may help clarify some of the... that I think would help make your case.
Yeah. the fall, free will, and faith. I don't think I want to make those arguments tonight, and I think I would rather leave those for professional philosophers to work on, because I have some disagreements with some fellow Christians on those subjects. So I think I'll leave that one alone, with all due respect.
And I want to make the point that I think that's totally appropriate for him to do, because that would be, he would have to, it would be unfair of him to make him try to answer that question in the short time that we have here. So that's completely appropriate.
Please, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you. And I appreciate both of you being here. This isn't the first debate I've ever got to come to, and I've really enjoyed it. But what I wanted to say, and then lead to a question, or just something for you to address, is I was surprised that on both sides, in addressing the reasonableness of the Christian faith, is that the heart of man didn't come into it. And, just dealing with, and we talked about so many old books and historical things and old writings. And yes, we weren't there right then to know, exactly what it was like, or were these a fable, or were they true? And so we disprove things based on that. But we have so many modern day, testimonies and documented things and writings and what's happening right in the world among us right now, where the hearts of men are changed, and sometimes it's pretty radical. And I know there's a lot of people who claim the name of Christ and do wrong things, bad things, but in some cases it's called a rebirth or a born again experience, because you start out as a baby, and babies make a lot of mistakes.
Could you pose your question?
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm leading to it. I just wanted to say, can you deal with the modern day reasonableness of it? Everything was so based on old things, but modern day, yes, the hearts of men are changed and for good, and they are doing things for the world. Okay, thanks.
I'll take it, then you can follow me. So if I understand correctly, this sounds like an issue I addressed in my book, Sense and Goodness Without God. I have a chapter on comparing different religions. And in reality, this kind of changed life, this sort of rebirth experience, is very common. Also in The Christian Delusion, Valerie Tarico is a psychologist who talks about this experience. Many different faith traditions and atheists have had these same kinds of...
Yes, changed experience, or say I have a new
heart.
experience.
That's right.
But some, like in religions
Ma'am.
where women are sacrificed when their husbands die in the Hindu religion,
Yeah.
I'm saying that leads towards good things and changing the world in a positive way.
So the question is what I assume is that if you have this experience, does that make continuing to believe what the experience is tied to reasonable? I've had that changed experience when I became a Taoist. I had this really epiphany that changed me as a person and made me a better person, I think. But I since realized that the religion was false, but all the things that made me better remained true, even though Taoism itself is false. And I think that's the reality of many atheists. You talk to anyone who had that kind of experience and then later became an unbeliever, they'll tell you the same thing, that they have retained all of the things, the lessons they learned from that experience, even though they realize that the religion that experience was at the time tied to was false. So I don't think just having those kinds of experiences means that it's unreasonable, or means that it's reasonable to believe the religion, precisely because lots of different religions cause those experiences, and even non-religions cause those experiences. So it's not the religion that's doing it; it's something else in the nature of man that's doing it. And I think it comes down to the same kind of eureka moment that scientists have, and engineers have, and writers have, and so on in other domains. And if you have that same experience in the moral domain, or in the domain of your meaning of your life, and so forth, you're going to have that same experience. And if at the time you have that experience, you associate it with some religion that just happens to be in your life, you will mistake the experience as being caused by the faith principles of that religion, when in reality it's being caused by your brain coming to a realization.
First of all, about the old stuff, if you find fingerprints on a window pane, the fingerprints might have been placed there a long time ago, but you can tell from the characteristics of the fingerprints that a person has been here and who that person was. And you can tell from the characteristics of the Gospels that a person has been here and a lot about who that person was, and I think that's powerful evidence for who Jesus is and the reasonableness of Christianity. Secondly, as far as conversion experiences go, yes, people do have remarkable experiences of conversion in various different religions, some for the better, some for the worse. Malcolm X is a great example. But I would argue that the gospel has been the center course of human reform, not coincidentally, but because of the teachings and example of Jesus down through the thousands of years, and because of the work of the Holy Spirit in human lives. But that would take a very long debate to develop that point.
Thank you. Please.
My question is for Dr. Richard Carrier, and I noticed there is an argument used a lot in the gospel evidence and how like the gospel writers don't tell us their sources. And I'm a history student here, and I've read some of like Josephus and Tacitus and the ancient historians, and since you're an ancient historian, I know you have too. And one thing I notice when I read them, and many scholars think they're reasonably accurate, not infallible, of course. But one thing I notice when I read them is that they do occasionally tell us what their source was for some specific thing, unlike the Gospels, but it's still very rare. They're still more tied into the narrative, a lot like the Gospel. So I just want to know, like, your thoughts on that, and do you agree that, like, Greco-Roman history writers did that a lot?
Yeah, it varies. The way they use sources and the way they cited them, and also the kinds of claims they use or made and so on, and the way they analyze them. I give an example in Chapter 7 of Not the Impossible Faith, comparing Suetonius, who we consider one of our unreliable historians. Not most unreliable, but on that end of the spectrum. Comparing him to the Book of Acts, for example, or the Gospels even. And even Suetonius comes out better. The reality is that we don't trust a lot of what the ancient historians write, including Tacitus and Josephus. We're pretty sure they're making some stuff up or getting some things wrong. But not everything. And some things we can corroborate independently. So it's a case-by-case basis. There's a book by an author named Grant. I can't remember the exact title, but it's something like Greek and Roman Historians, Information and Misinformation, which tells the story of why we really don't and shouldn't trust ancient historians too much. We don't throw them out completely like the baby with the bathwater. And in another debate, I made the point that there's a certain amount of things I would trust in Tacitus, but if Tacitus were a manual for building a rocket ship, I would not get on that rocket.
Let me think. What was I? I was thinking of something there. I forgot what it was. Yeah. What was the question?
It was about the...
Sorry, I did 4 hours of lecturing this morning. Oh, yes. Okay. And then I remember the point I was going to make. Yeah. A really good source, a really good book on, a couple of good books on the book of Acts as a historian are by Ben Witherington. And I think he rehabilitates Acts in a spectacular way and shows that he's a very reliable historian. But again, I'm arguing not just from ordinary history and saying Luke is a good historian. I'm also saying that there is what you could call forensic evidence in the Gospels that points to the reliability of those texts.
Thank you.
Okay, after you've read Witherington, read Richard Purvow's commentary on Acts, or if you want something much shorter that's not nearly as detailed as either of those books, Richard Purvow's book, it's called The Mystery of Acts. It's a little tiny book. By the end of it, you will throw Acts in the trashes when it comes to reliable historians.
Thank you. Please.
Thanks. Hi, yes, thank you guys. Appreciate y'all coming out. This is for Dr. Carrier, and there at the end of your talk there, I think that I got down that you had mentioned that Christianity would be reasonable. Number one, if it's true. So if it's not true, it's not reasonable. And secondly, if it had been taught from the very beginning everywhere. Now, I myself am not an atheist, although I wouldn't go so far as to say, so I don't believe atheism is true. However, I believe that there are probably good atheists here that are reasonable people, and that atheism itself is a coherent or reasonable worldview without necessarily being true or taught everywhere. So my question is, given your own criteria for the reasonableness of Christianity, would atheism, according to that criteria, be true?
Yeah, I gave 3 criteria.
Yeah, that was earlier, and I agree with those 3 criteria. They were good, but at the end there.
those three criteria. Those are the ones. So apply those. When you do, I mean, atheists aren't making any supernatural claims, so they don't have to prove supernatural powers behind them. So all we need to do is find that the evidence backs us. If you want, and we didn't debate whether atheism was reasonable or whether God, for example, I made the point that whether God exists is not relevant to this debate. But if you are interested in whether atheism is reasonable and my case for it and the reasoning I have for it, The End of Christianity has some of the best chapters on that and compares, there's one chapter on Christianity and one on the design argument. I think you should read both of those and you'll see pretty well why I am where I am in this debate. So.
I appreciate this. Quick follow-up, if that's okay.
If you would let Dr. Marshall.
Oh, I'm sorry.
If you wanted to say.
Yeah. One of Richard's, I don't know if you call him a mentor, but teachers on Bayes' theorem originally, early on he was reading Tim McGrew, who was professor of philosophy at Western Michigan University. And I recently asked him what he would think. I'm not going to say anything disparaging here, but I asked him what he thought about the possibility of using Bayes' theorem, which I know nothing about, I'll admit, to investigate the idea of miracles and whether atheism is reasonable. In order for atheism to be true, basically all of the miracles, all of the supernatural signs that have happened, all the wonderful answers to prayers that people have experienced, including intelligent, educated people, would all have to be delusional, mistaken, frauds, lies, and whatnot. What are the odds of that? I don't think they're very high. Now, there are some aspects of atheism that I think are kind of intellectually fetching, but I don't think it's at all likely that atheism could be true just because of that.
And that's incorrect in terms of probability theory. If you have, for example, we don't really know, for example, whether the supernatural exists. So you can't argue that because it would require natural explanations for everything, that therefore the supernatural has to be probable. That's not sound reasoning. All we can do is look at specific cases. You would look at one case and then do a calculation, do another case, do a calculation, and so on. At the end of that run of Bayesian equations, you would not end up with a high probability of the supernatural. You would end up with a low probability of the supernatural. But I'm not going to explain, because we didn't go into Bayes' theorem here, so I'm not going to explain how that would happen. But if you want some of the background for the logic of this, it is in my book, Proving History. Proving History is designed for historians and humanities majors, so it's designed for people who are afraid of math. So if you want to learn Bayes' theorem and you're a humanities major or a historian or whatever, or if you're not, but you want to see how Bayes' theorem can be applied to historical questions, including miracles, and I give specific examples of miracles that I analyze in there with Bayes' theorem, that book explains it to you, explains how the theorem works and how you would go about even proving that miracles existed if they did. So that's the book to look at for that.
We have 1 minute left in our Q&A, so maybe we'll go a couple of minutes over, but this will be the last question.
Good evening, gentlemen. A question for each of you. Dr. Carrier, what are the implications for your philosophical outlook in respect to the Shroud of Turin and the Veronica cloth? And Dr. Marshall, what are the implications for your belief as it relates to the divinity of Christ, where clearly he was wrong in several statements of his beliefs or what he saw, namely that he did not come back in the time that he indicated in the Gospels, and two, we seem to have evolved, which would put at variance the Genesis account of Adam and Eve.
For the Shroud of Turin, that would be a whole other debate. The book to read, Joe Nickell wrote a book on it. I'd start with that if you want to know why I don't think that there's anything miraculous about the Shroud of Turin. We actually have records of a confessed forger of it. The carbon dating matches the date of that forger. And all of the attempts to rehabilitate it as somehow supernatural are based on bad science. So it's a classic kind of UFOs and aliens kind of scenario. But like I said, to try and defend that here would take a while. So look at Joe Nickell's book from there, and then you can Google further beyond that. But Joe Nickell's book was the first one to read.
Let's see. Evolution was one thing, and the return of Jesus was the other question.
That's correct, sir.
Yeah. On the return of Jesus, I admit there's some passages that look like Jesus is prophesying that he's going to return sooner than he actually has so far. I think that most of the things Jesus did prophesy, however, have come true and came true in his life and later on. So, I'm willing to cut the records a little bit of slack and how those records are interpreted. Apparently, Jesus didn't mean right away. As far as evolution goes, there's a lot of different perspectives on that different Christians have. My own perspective is I think there is some evidence in biology and in physics for God and for creation. I'm not a young earth creationist. I think that God, like the tree planted in the ground that grew up over many years, in this case many millions of years, I think that God created slowly. And exactly how he did that is a subject for a very long debate involving people much more qualified than anybody probably on this stage tonight. But I think it's a fascinating question and a fascinating discussion when it occurs.
Thank you.
Please,
We were going to end the debate.
if you don't mind.
I do mind. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Can you ask after? Last.
He'll
Okay.
be at a table afterwards.
Richard?
You can ask him.
Are you okay?
I want to make a statement and I want to ask a question. First of all, do you all remember the first of the 10 Commandments?
May you ask the question?
I am the Lord thy God, thou shalt not have false gods before me. Never did he give the authority and say, I am the Lord thy God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Prophet Jesus is not divine. Like Christmas and Sunday, Emperor Constantine, in order to paganize the Christian people, said, you can believe in the sun, which was the sun. This is why the winter solstice is in...
Ma'am, could you ask a question, please?
Okay. In the fact that you know that paganism is intertwined in Christianity, how can you continue to not question the divinity of Prophet Jesus? We, as Muslims, also believe that he will be coming back, but it is a major sin on the Day of Judgment to associate God with a partner. Never did Prophet Jesus say, worship me. And how do you attribute paganism being intertwined? And why is it Christians are not fighting against that? The Unitarian Christians understand, but why is it they're allowing the worship of a human being to permeate? Satan has gotten to everybody in the way of convincing us that Prophet Jesus was God and the Son of God. God does not beget. Only humans and animals beget.
Thank you. May we give the speaker?
Well, God actually says that
Ma'am,
we
ma'am.
diminish his greatness by attributing
I'm very
him.
sorry. I did
Well,
not
how
mean to
is
be
it
rude.
you can...
Yes. Yes.
Okay,
Please.
thank you for the question. I did 4 hours of lecture this morning on Christianity and world religions, and we did talk a little bit about Islam. I wish very much this lady had come to those lectures, and we could have had a wonderful discussion, I think. The Christian doctrine of the Trinity, I don't think I have time to defend it tonight as much as I would like to. But I will say this word. Jesus said, and boy, this gets me in hot water again. Jesus said, don't think I've come to do away with the law and the prophets. I've come to fulfill the law and the prophets. And I believe Jesus is the fulfillment of the deepest desires of human beings around the world, including those one might call pagans. And the person I quoted earlier on, Lin Yutang, was an excellent example of that. I don't have time to explain what it was, but he said that we Chinese pagans have always believed in God. Now, that's a little bit of an overgeneralization, but I think the relationship between paganism and Christianity is not quite as negative. There are some negative characteristics. The gospel does repudiate harmful behavior and all kinds of things, but it's not entirely a negative relationship, in my opinion. But I'd love to talk about that more, but I think that's probably enough.
Okay. Thank you all for coming.